Have you ever tried to 3D model your dream bike? You spend days, if not weeks, trying to perfect it, just to end up with something else. Something that has wheels, but is not quite what you expected.
Why doesn't mine look like that?
How can you fix this big, yet very common problem? How can you finally make your 3D models look like what you expected them to be? The first thing that I want you to know is that you're not the only one. I started 3D modeling back in 2018, and I went through a lot of struggles, as you can imagine. From a car that looks more like a skateboard to a camera that looks more like a hammer, and other failed attempts that I made back then and I don't even remember what they mean today. And after 3 years of failing, I'm finally able to model what I was somewhat expecting. And in this video, I'll be sharing with you 6 tips that will considerably improve your 3D modeling. Tip number 1. Start simple. Even though you've probably heard this advice more than once, it is still not followed nor understood by most beginners. Learn the basics first and you will be good to go. As beginners, we're always tempted to make the coolest 3D models very early on, even though we haven't grasped the very basics yet. If you're just starting out, you will learn much more and much faster by modeling the simplest objects you can find, like a cup, a spoon. This will help you identify your problems more easily. You will learn so much more doing this than trying to model, let's say, a car or a plane at first. Learning the basics can be very boring and even discouraging to beginners. But keep this one thing in mind. Every complex object in this world you can ever imagine can be broken down into the simplest forms. Its complexity only depends on the quantity of those simple forms combined. The more simple forms you have in an object, the more complicated it will look. You need to master the simplest techniques and try to combine them in order to make more complex models. That's it. Complicated things are just a combination of many simple things. That's it. Tip number 2. Keep the real-world scale in mind. If you're modeling an object that's meant to make sense in a real-world environment, which most objects do by the way, then it also makes perfect sense to have an average character interact with your model in the very early block-out phase. This will be very helpful to spot proportional errors before going into more detail. If you're, for example, blocking out a game console and you just realize that it doesn't fit correctly in your character's hands, then you need to fix that problem now, before you even think of detailing your model further. I personally use softwares like DAZ Studio to pause my characters on my models. And speaking of detail, we go to our tip number 3. Never go into detail if your bigger forms are already wrong. This is one of the biggest mistakes almost every beginner makes at some point. When you think that adding in more detail will help fix the overall form, then keep this in mind. If you add more detail to a wrong shape, you'll just make it more wrong. Primary, secondary, and tertiary form blockout is a fundamental rule in many art fields like drawing, sculpting, and even other disciplines. If you're making a car, for example, make sure that the hood is the correct height in relation to the other forms. Make sure that the character can naturally fit inside the car without having their head go through the hood or even their feet touch the ground. Tip number 4. Form follows function. Form follows function is a very well-known industrial design term, which states that every design that's meant to serve a purpose, like a car meant for transportation, a chair that's meant to be sat on, should have its purpose solved before deciding its final shape. That's known as the affordance of a design. For example, if you're modeling a motorbike, make sure that when the rider turns the steering wheel, it doesn't on its way intersect nor touch unsupposed parts of the bike. Also make sure that an average human being can sit on the bike and operate it correctly without being constrained by any physics. In these 2 examples, we can clearly see the effect of a positive and a negative affordance on a design. So in other terms, the purpose of a design always comes before the look of that design. Tip number 5. There is no better reference than real life. Even though this seems obvious to most of us, we often tend to look for reference of things online when the best objects we can learn modeling from are right next to us. You can pick any simple item in your house and try to model it. You will immediately find out that it's much faster and more efficient to learn this way than trying to collect various pictures online and end up missing on some major details due to the lack of resolution or not enough reference from specific angles. There is no better reference than what you can hold in your hands, so take advantage of that. Tip number 6. See how other 3D artists do it. There is no better way to learn anything than watching how the experts do it. Try to look for your favorite 3D artist. They probably have a breakdown of their work online, so go check that. Or even better, you can download some of their 3D models if available. And one of the best websites I know is Sketchfab. It has a real-time interactive window where you can navigate around the model, look at their wireframe, all in the same viewport. When doing so, I recommend you to observe how polygons are connected. Look at how they spread the density over the whole model. Look at what details they kept as geometry and what others they left as normal map. You will learn so much by just doing this. For example, I would have never guessed back then that these tire prints were actually normal map, nor these ones, because I always thought that everything was geometry. I hope that this video has been helpful for you. If it has, you can consider subscribing for future content like this.